Welcome, everyone. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. It's wonderful to have you all with us. We're finding at the Atlantic Council is this period of telework, now in 8 weeks, has been in many ways very difficult for all of us. In other ways, it's connected us more closely digitally. We have found that it is not social distance. We can bring our communities even closer together. It's really just physical distance. And you'll see through this call, through the large number of people we have on it, through the high amount of interest in this issue, that we, in many respects, can do or perform our mission, which is shaping the future together with friends and allies, even more effectively at this period of time where we have a global audience listening in for this important event. We're delighted to host you all for a discussion about the future of Idlib and Syria's internally displaced persons, or IDPs. And we're honored to be joined by Ambassador James Jeffrey and Ambassador Ibrahim Kalin. Ambassador Kalin will be joining us a little bit later. He's been called into a meeting with President Erdogan, but he'll be with us shortly and within the call. At a time when the coronavirus pandemic is dominating the news cycle and public discourse, it's telling that so many of you are participating in a discussion on a different kind of crisis. What we're finding is that the COVID crisis is making some crises worse, but it's also opening up some crises to different sorts of solutions. And we're going to hear from our speakers here what impact it's having, but also what is going on the ground in a general sense. As many of you know, the Atlantic Council has invested significant resources on shedding light on the crisis in Syria, how it impacts our European allies, its geopolitical and socioeconomic impact on the wider Middle East, and of course, the very important bilateral relationship we have with Turkey presently and throughout history. Through both our Atlantic Council in Turkey program and the Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East, we regularly provide a platform for engagement with relevant government officials and other stakeholders on Syria. We will hear about the political, military, and humanitarian situation in Syria, US-Turkey relations and opportunities for cooperation in Idlib, prospects for the resolution of the war in Syria, and the necessary measures the international community needs to take to secure the lives of Syrian civilians. This is the kind of situation that should not go off our radar screens, even at a moment of COVID-19. The situation on the ground in Idlib, Syria's last rebel stronghold, remains precarious. The Assad regime's offensive on the province has displaced about 1 million Syrian and now more than 2 million IDPs are squeezed into a small borderland next to Turkey, creating an enormous humanitarian challenge. Turkey and Russia negotiated a ceasefire in early March, but it's proved difficult to maintain, with violent clashes posing another threat to civilians. The difficult conditions of Syrian IDPs in Idlib are only exacerbated by the coronavirus pandemic, given the ease of contagion and lack of resources in the tiny, overcrowded border zone. The crisis presents, as many crises do, opportunities. Washington can show real leadership in Syria by taking humanitarian action via Turkey to help those suffering in densely populated IDP camps in areas with limited supply. However, it also raises important questions about the future of US and Turkish policy in Syria and important questions about US-Turkish relations. After I introduce our speakers, they will each give remarks before participating. Actually, the remarks of Ambassador Kalin will come when he joins us. But Ambassador Jeffrey will give his remarks before a session moderated by Defne Sadiklar Arslan, Director of the Atlantic Council in Turkey program. I want to salute you, Defne, and your remarkable team of Pinar and Grady as well. And she'll be joined by Will Wexler, Director of the Council's Rafi Hariri Center and Middle East Programs. You can join the discussion on Twitter as well by following at AC_Istanbul and at AC Mideast. Ambassador Jeffrey, and I'll introduce Ambassador Jeffrey now. I think I'll wait to introduce Ambassador Kalin. Well, actually, I'll introduce both now, and that way we can get right into it when Ambassador Kalin joins us. So Ambassador Jeffrey currently serves as the Secretary's Special Representative for Syria Engagement and Special Envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS. He is one of the finest diplomats of his generation, of our generation. His experience in political security and energy issues is in the Middle East, Turkey, Germany, and the Balkans. He's held senior assignments in Washington, D.C. and abroad, including Deputy National Security Advisor from 2007 to 2008, Ambassador to Iraq from 2010 to 2012, Ambassador to Turkey from 2008 to 2010, Ambassador to Albania from 2002 to 2004, and in 2010, Ambassador Jeffrey was appointed to the highest rank in the U.S. Foreign Service Career Ambassador. From 1969, this is the part I like the most, from 1969 to 1976, Ambassador Jeffrey was a U.S. infantry officer with service in Germany and Vietnam. And anyone who's been a U.S. infantry officer has served his country well. Definitely, I think I'm actually going to hold off on Ambassador Kalin's introduction until he can join us. So with that introduction of Ambassador Jeffrey, let's first welcome him and ask him to give remarks.
Thank you, Fred. Daphne, Will Wexler, I really appreciate being on today. Let me get right to the question at hand, Idlib. Idlib is the crucible of the entire conflict in Syria at this point since it began in 2011. We are delighted that the Syrian army and its Russian and Iranian allies were halted there by largely by action by the Turkish military, and that there is now a Russian and Turkish ceasefire. As mentioned earlier, this could have created a humanitarian disaster with not only the 1 million people that have been moved within Idlib, but several million more who have fled there, coming across the border into Turkey and beyond. For the moment, that has been stopped, but it still remains a danger. Secondly, there is a geostrategic risk of the regime taking over Idlib, the last area where there are a lot of Syrian opposition fighters on the ground. This is the question before us. Will the Syrian government continue this offensive and push for a military victory? Or are we at a point that this ceasefire holds and we can move to a political settlement of the conflict under UN Resolution 2254? The US position is very clear. First of all, we strongly support this ceasefire. We strongly support the Turkish military action. We believe that this ceasefire is consistent with UN Special Envoy Geir Pedersen's call for a countrywide ceasefire. We are delighted that the Turkish forces are keeping various terrorist groups, notably Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, under control as part of the original ceasefire agreement from September 2018 for Idlib. We hope that continues. In addition, we have heard from many sources, including even Russian, that there is a general feeling that this ceasefire is living up to expectations, that attacks by various terrorist elements out of Idlib are at an all-time low, and that there's a good chance that the ceasefire will hold. That certainly is what we're putting all of our effort into. What we hope to do, building on this ceasefire, is to turn to the overall conflict. There, we will double our efforts in the following areas. First, to support the Constitutional Committee, which has just agreed on an agenda. The Russians were helpful there, pressuring the Assad regime to negotiate an eventual new constitution and prepare the way for national elections under the UN. Also, we're continuing our pressure campaign, sanctions and other economic pressure on the regime to get it to accept a compromise solution. We are holding the regime accountable. We support the UN Secretary General's Board of Inquiry, condemning the regime and its Russian supporters for bombing targets that were provided to the regime by the UN as humanitarian and other medical facilities. We're happy at the OPCW's clear condemnation of the highest levels of the regime for chemical weapons attacks in March 2017. But the Secretary General's report on UN Resolution 2504 on border crossings, calling out the regime for not allowing humanitarian transfers across battle lines, even in this time of COVID-19, and for the German government, which is prosecuting torturers of Syrian civilians right now in Germany. We think this should continue. Meanwhile, we're supporting all of our partners and allies around Syria who have major security concerns there. I mentioned Turkey, but also Israel, Jordan, Iraq, and on into the Arab world. We are absolutely convinced that we can find a political solution to this conflict with one condition: the Idlib ceasefire has to hold. I'll stop there, Fred.
Thank you, Ambassador, just for these intro remarks. Before I continue with my questions to you, if I may take 2 minutes to make some announcements regarding Q&A to our audience, if I may. So I would like to welcome you again, Ambassador Jeffrey. It's an honor to host you, and also it's an honor hosting our distinguished audience today. And I'm all very happy to welcome you all for this very timely discussion. As Fred mentioned, Fred Kemp, my name is Defne Arslan. I am the Atlantic Council in Turkey Program Director. Now we will move on to our moderation discussion, where my colleague, Atlantic Council Rafi Hariri Center Middle East Programs Director, Will Wexler, and I will pose a series of questions to both Ambassador and when, of course, Ambassador Kalin can join us. After our moderated discussion, you, the audience, will have the opportunity to suggest your questions through the chat function, which can be opened by clicking on the chat button at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. We will do our best to address all of them. Please include your name, title, and affiliation when writing your questions. Unfortunately, anonymous questions will not be addressed. And I also would like to encourage every one of you to start writing and submitting your questions now. You do not have to wait until the Q&A begins. So, coming to our moderation, Mr. Ambassador, if I may start with a question to you. Let's start with a few questions about the immediate humanitarian crisis around Idlib, which you have already mentioned and Fred Kemp already touched in his intro remarks, which is only getting worse given the pandemic, unfortunately. Ambassador Jeffrey, on March 3rd, the United States has announced 108 million in assistance for Syrians, but whether that aid can be effectively brought into Idlib remains unclear. Can the United States and Turkey work together to take the humanitarian action in the province? In particular, how they can counter Russian unwillingness of on allowing direct medical aid and other vital assistance via Turkey-Syria border? Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Daphne. I accompanied our UN ambassador, Kelly Craft, to the Idlib Turkey border now just 6 weeks ago to look into that situation on the ground. We talked to Mr. Lowcock, the UN's humanitarian coordinator, and other officials, including the governor of Hatay, the Turkish governor of Hatay. We are convinced that we can move that money across the border from Turkey. Right now, the UN resolution I mentioned earlier, 2504, authorizes 2 crossings from Turkey into northern Syria, and we will be using those crossings in conjunction with our Turkish partners. Our bigger concern is in the northeast. That's outside of the purview of the discussion right now, but there the Russians blocked the continuation of a crossing from Iraq, and that's where we have most of our problems. But as you said, definitely, the humanitarian crisis is absolutely horrendous right now. It will get worse if the offensive starts. The United States, which has contributed $10.6 billion for humanitarian aid for Syria, will remain the largest contributor, but we need help from the international community. We need the Russians to get the Syrians to relax their obstacles, including possibly closing those two crossings in July when 2504 comes up for renewal. That is at the top of our priorities right now. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Well, if I may continue with Ambassador Jeffrey again as planned, since we are still waiting for Ambassador Kalin. Ambassador Jeffrey, to continue with your remarks, just another question about this humanitarian crisis. And actually, this was going to be both to you and also Ambassador Kalin. So we may be repeating this also for Mr. Kalin when he joins. COVID-19 presents a real threat for Syrian IDPs in Idlib. Even though we don't seem to have it right now. Large number of people are living in camps or temporary housing where social distancing is difficult. There's a lack of medical services and many of the hospitals and medical centers have been bombed. How do you think COVID-19 can impact the ongoing crisis in Idlib moving forward? Just so even though you already touched some of it, just in your previous remarks, can you elaborate and just speak on this a bit more, please?
The humanitarian situation under, I'm misusing the word, normal times in Idlib, where 3.5, perhaps 4 million people jammed in, most of them definitely from other parts of Syria fleeing the horrific Assad regime, is already beyond imagination. COVID-19 will make it even worse. The one thing we know, because we've seen this in other areas, is no matter how bad it gets, almost none of that population will return to Assad's control unless forced to. The situation in his areas is so bad for that population that they will put up with essentially anything. So the COVID situation will make things worse. I don't think it will have a major impact on the overall diplomatic layout that I covered earlier.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Ambassador, if I could just turn a little bit to the state of the diplomatic efforts, to resolve the conflict. The ceasefire that you mentioned that the United States strongly supports quelled some of the violence, which of course was at a quite high moment immediately before that, at least initially. Can you look ahead into the future and see and tell us if Washington and Ankara see any potential to build upon this ceasefire to move the diplomatic process forward more rapidly than it has been going for the last number of years?
As I mentioned, we've already seen one step forward with the Constitutional Committee agreement on the agenda. Geir Pedersen, the UN envoy, has ambitious plans to leverage that for one or another set of meetings, depending on the situation with COVID-19. But as I said, he's pressing forward. He has our full support. We're also talking to the Russians about the possibility of a compromise solution. We have been doing this for years, but we think that the ceasefire in Idlib and the encouraging of small steps with the Constitutional Committee, as well as the bad situation the Assad regime has found itself in economically in terms of its reputation, leaves the door a bit more open for success in these discussions. But again, we're slowed down somewhat because of the restrictions on travel, but we are putting a great deal of effort into leaving no stone unturned with the UN, with the Russians, with the countries in the region, with our European partners to find a solution to this thing. This is a terrible tragedy, not only for the people of Syria, half of whom have fled their homes from Assad, hundreds of thousands, perhaps as many as 500,000 have been killed. It is also an extraordinary danger for the entire region. We have real combat between organized military forces. You saw the Turks up against the Syrian and Russian army a few weeks ago. You've seen what occasionally is admitted as Israeli aircraft taking on Iranian and Syrian targets. You've seen terrible accidents such as a shoot down of a Russian aircraft in September 2018 by their own allies, the Syrians. This thing can escalate at any time. We have American troops on the ground. Other countries have troops on the ground. We're very concerned about it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Just so So I'm just looking at, I don't think we still have Ambassador Kalin, so we will continue, Ambassador Jeffrey, with other questions if we may. So we will come back to the humanitarian issue, but there are also other subjects that we would like to discuss here today, as you know, Ambassador, Ambassador Jeffrey, just with the withdrawal of US troops from Northeast, how does Washington plan to deal with the potential resurgence of the Islamic State? We read reports of increasing difficulties in the Deir az-Zor region, and many are concerned about the ISIS fighters who have been released through the tribal deals. What is your policy regarding a solution there, sir?
Thank you. That is an important component of our overall policy towards Syria, the enduring defeat of ISIS. We have not pulled our troops out of northeast Syria. We have repositioned them since October, when the Turks launched Operation Peace Spring into part of the northeast. A few days later, we came to a ceasefire with the Turks. We call it by a different name, but that's what it was. And we've repositioned our forces. Our forces are working very closely with the Syrian Democratic Forces, our partner in the fight against ISIS. We do not believe that ISIS has been able to exploit seriously the COVID crisis to advance in the northeast. Although, as you mentioned, Daphne, the area around Deir az-Zor is, as we say these days, a hot spot. We're watching that closely, but we are confident that we have it under control. Where it is not under control is beyond the northeast. South of the Euphrates, in regime areas, one consequence of the focus on Idlib by what's left of Assad's inept army is that few forces are left to deal with ISIS in the southwest, in the Badia Desert, and that is of great concern to us. We have seen ISIS gaining ground there, attacking even towns, and at least briefly holding territory. That has to stop. We've offered to cooperate with the Russians on this, but as long as the focus is on Idlib, that is yet another consequence.
Thank you, sir. Will?
Yeah, Mr. Ambassador, I'd like to just take a step back. There's a lot of talk that you no doubt deal with every day here in Washington that say that the United States shouldn't be in the Middle East at all, and it certainly shouldn't be in Syria. And Syria is Turkey's problem, and there are very little U.S. interests in Syria. Can you talk to us a little bit about why that argument is wrong, and what American withdrawal from Syria would mean in terms of the impact on the ground and the opening the door to Russia and Iran?
Well, first of all, the United States has readjusted its focus. As you'll remember when you were in government, Will, much of it was on counterterrorism and essentially combat reconstruction of countries in the Middle East. We're shifting very rapidly away from that to great power competition. I want to underline to all of the viewers and listeners, we are not pulling back from the world. We are shifting in some areas to a more focused counter great power posture. And the Middle East is one of the major theaters for such competition. We have Russia there. We have Iran, which we see as a regional not great, but significant power that we compete along with much of the rest of the region. And over the horizon, we have China with economic, diplomatic, and eventually military interests in the region. I could go on all day with how important the region is, even if right now oil prices are down because demand is low. That's a consequence of COVID. In a year or two, that will be over. The world needs close to 100 million barrels of oil a day. Much of it comes from the Middle East. Even if we don't need it in America because of fracking, our trading partners in the world economy needs it. We need to keep that in mind. We've seen how terror, if not contained in the Middle East, strikes from Paris to Washington to New York. And again, we have partners and allies. NATO is on the borders with Turkey. We have our long-term partner, Israel, much threatened by Iran and other forces in that region. So we have plenty of reasons to be there. But the last reason I would like to emphasize, and this goes back a long way, Fred, as an Atlanticist, would probably remember this. NATO survived because Germany, although swept by pacifism and neutralism after World War II, decided to sign up in the 1950s. The key reason the Germans did that was confidence after seeing how we lost tens of thousands of American troops to hold a piece of territory called South Korea, which had no alliance with us, 10,000 miles away, led the Germans to think that in a much more important place we could be counted upon. Collective global security is indivisible. You can't succeed in the Baltics, you can't succeed in the South China Sea if you're not also succeeding in Idlib, if you're not also succeeding in Baghdad, in the Gulf, in the Sinai.
Thank you very much for that. I have one more question before I think it's time to open it up to the questions from the audience, and I'll let my colleague Defna take the lead from that. But you know, the most recent tensions and conflict in the Idlib area, of course, went into overdrive when 34 Turkish soldiers were killed by a precision airstrike in the Bayloon area. There's still some question in the press about who was responsible for that. But we noted that Secretary Pompeo just a couple of weeks ago said that, quote, "We believe Russia has killed dozens of Turkish military personnel in the course of their military operation." Was he referring to this strike or something else?
I'll let his words stand for themselves. I was aware and worked on the language that we used. Russia and the Russian military and the Syrian military are joined at the hip, particularly in the Idlib operation. They have joint control centers. They have a joint, what you would recognize from your Department of Defense days is electronic and radar picture of what is going on. And they exchange intelligence and operational information all of the time, regardless of who dropped the bombs. And we cannot say who that was in this forum. We are absolutely convinced that the Russians had a role.
Thank you very much, sir. Defna, would you like to ask the first question from the audience?
Yes, absolutely. You know, just thank you, Mr. Ambassador. You know, just we have many questions and we have many participants to this event. And unfortunately, we are still waiting on hold for Ambassador Kalin. But I will just go to the Q&A box and get one of the questions from there, you know, just very quickly, you know, just Mr. Ambassador, you know, just one question comes. What kind of outcome the U.S. is expecting and desiring through the ceasefires, the Astana process, and what is U.S. take on the Astana process, and what is your expectation moving forward? You know, just Turkey also working together with Russia on some of the issues.
Thank you. I'll start with the Astana process. One good thing about the Astana process is that our partner Turkey is one of the three members of that process. That's the only good thing about the process as far as we're concerned. You will note that every ceasefire in action that I have seen, including the September 2018 Idlib ceasefire, the ceasefire at Sochi between the Turks and the Russians in the Northeast in October, and this most recent one, was not negotiated in the Astana format, but bilaterally between the Turks and the Russians. And frankly, we encourage the two to work together. The problem with the Astana process is that it is a patent attempt by the Russians and the Iranians to seize the initiative from the United Nations, which has been tasked in UN Resolution 2254, December 2015, and prior UN resolutions to be responsible for something that impacts not just Russia, Iran, and Turkey, but as I said, Israel, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, and many other countries in the region, and as far afield as Europe, which has felt the twin curses of huge unregulated refugee flows and terrorist attacks coming out of Syria. This is the crisis that keeps on giving us reasons to engage as an international community, not in three countries. Now, getting back to Idlib, what we hope to see is the ceasefire to continue. We hope to see the Turks continue to put pressure on the terrorist organizations there. the most powerful of them, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. There have been some exchanges of fire. There's been some pressure on them. We hope to see that continue. That has the problems with that organization and others have given the Russians and the Syrian government the excuse before to break the ceasefire. We don't want them to have that excuse this time. We're very pleased that the Turks have reinforced their forces there, and they're committed to doing what is necessary to carry out the ceasefire. So that's really good, Daphne.
There's a question here, Mr. Ambassador, from Josh Rogan from the Washington Post that I think it's important to answer. 10,000 civilians are trapped in Camp Rukban, which is only 10 miles from the U.S. military base in Tanf. The regime in Russia prevented the UN aid shipments from reaching them for over a year. Given the urgency and given the pandemic, why won't the U.S. military just feed these starving people?
First of all, Josh is right. Rukban is a humanitarian disaster that we are really concerned about. There is some good news. 2 years ago, there were perhaps 50,000 people in that camp working with the Jordanian government, particularly with the UN, which has been superb in the Rukban case, with even the Syrian Red Cross and with the Russian military. We have been able to effect 3 humanitarian deliveries since the fall of 2018, and some perhaps 40,000 people have left. But we still have serious problems with the remaining people. We do not have, I can't get into the classified information on the military presence there and its mission, which is to defeat ISIS, but it is not equipped, organized, or capable of taking on the humanitarian mission of the remaining 10,000 people. We have been consulting with the Jordanian government up until 2018. Humanitarian and medical assistance has come from Jordan. In fact, it continued until recently in terms of medical assistance. And we're continuing to talk with the UN and with the Russians and indirectly through the UN with the Syrian Red Crescent on possible solutions. But we acknowledge what Josh said, that this is a very serious problem.
I have one more question from another reporter that I see, Humaira Pamuk, who's a State Department correspondent for Reuters. This question is, has the United States seen any signs that Turkey is moving against the HTS in Idlib? There was a minor confrontation this week where they tried to clear the M4 for a patrol.
Yes, we have all seen, and I think most of it, frankly, is in the open sources reporting. But that's a good question to ask Ibrahim Kalin when he arrives. How's that?
Good answer. Daphne?
Yes, yes. Ambassador Jeffrey, I have another question from a common friend of ours, Cansu Çamlıbel. You may remember her as well. Cansu asks, could you say that the United States in the foreseeable future does not expect Ankara government to proceed with a major ground operation to Rojava, as we suggested in the past so many times by President Erdogan? And is the vetting of civil and military councils in Manbij by the US concluded to get rid of YPG PYD members as requested by Turkey? Thank you.
First of all, on Manbij, we had an agreement with Turkey. We were in the process of carrying out that agreement when the Peace Spring operation came about. And so we no longer have a presence in Manbij. We no longer adhere to the Manbij agreement because it has been overtaken by events. Now, it's a complicated question, Daphne, involving the situation since October. But first of all, the United States and Turkey on the 17th of October, with Mike Pence leading the American team and President Erdogan personally leading the Turkish team, negotiated an arrangement, essentially a ceasefire, that established the Turkish area of Peace Spring. The agreement was that there would be no movement beyond the perimeter of that. Any movement beyond the perimeter of that would be a violation of the agreement. President Trump has made clear that he would react very, very rapidly and in a very decisive fashion, as he reacted immediately when the Turkish army began its offensive a week earlier. So that is the situation on the ground. That would be a blatant violation of the agreement, and we would respond. because it would put at risk our forces, it would put at risk the mission against ISIS, it would put at risk our partners in the population of Northeast Syria. It would create a further crisis. It took us 6 months to dig out of the terrible crisis of October. We now have Russian regime, Turkish supported opposition, SDF, and American forces, plus some remnants of ISIS, all in a very small area. It is a very complicated airspace. It's very complicated ground movements. We don't need more like that. So that's the situation that we have now in the northeastern Manbij.
Thank you, sir. I also see, Will, a lot of questions on, of course, bilateral issues, just so I know that Ambassador Satterfield is also on the line, just so I'm among the audience. Can we also, Ambassador Jeffrey, if we select some of the questions on bilateral issues, maybe we should refer it to U.S. Ambassador Turkey on these questions. Will that be okay? Just so if, for example, one of the questions is on the S-400s, and Turkey-U.S. relations. For example, does Ankara's decision to delay the deployment of S-400 system change Washington's calculus towards deploying Patriot missiles on the southern Turkish border is a question. And would you like to comment on, or shall we just leave that aside for Ambassador Satterfield, if he's willing to come in, of course?
Daphne, this is Ambassador Satterfield.
Ambassador, welcome. How honored to have you online. Thank you for joining.
Thank you very much. Daphne, I'll answer that. We've made our position quite explicit to President Erdogan, to all the senior leadership of Turkey. And that is the operation of the S-400 system is not compatible with Turkey's participation in acquisition of the F-35 program, and that it exposes Turkey to the very significant possibility of congressional sanctions, both those that invoke the CAATSA legislation and additional freestanding legislative sanctions. We have made our position clear, as I said. We do not have in our possession the assurances from the government of Turkey that would allow us to mitigate those concerns.
Can I ask a question now that we have both Ambassador Jeffrey and Ambassador Satterfield on the line? And it's one question that struck my eye from Laura Patel of the Financial Times. What can either of you tell us about Turkey's efforts to secure a swap line from the Federal Reserve? And is there a desire in Washington to help Turkey financially during these times?
Sure. I'll respond to this briefly. Turkey has been in direct contact, as have many states, with the Federal Reserve. There are certain requirements set by the Open Markets Committee of the Fed with respect to potential eligibility. They are financial, monetary requirements and conditions. They are not politically linked.
Thank you, sir, and thanks, Will, for this important question. Even and Ambassador Satterfield, just as we know, President Erdogan sent a letter to President Trump this week, calling for a stronger collaboration between the two NATO allies, and also sent Turkish medical equipment to the United States. Do you expect this, just to lead to some stronger cooperation in the future? Is this an intention for a greater collaboration in the future between two NATO allies?
Definitely, we cooperate extensively, as Jim has said, with Turkey. Turkey is a partner. It's a NATO ally. We work with them around the world on issues that are important to the alliance, that are important to both our countries. We have welcomed the Turkish contributions to the COVID fight. I was just this morning at a Turkish airbase witnessing the loading and takeoff of another shipment of donated personal protective equipment. All this goes on. The true story here is we have a rich, complex, cooperative relationship We do have differences. We have issues such as the S-400, which do require resolution for the extent of our relationship to be what it is that the president and we all would hope. But it right now is an extraordinarily strong partnership and alliance.
And Ambassador, and again to both ambassadors, depending on who wants to answer this, but I have a question about Turkey's relationship with Russia. There's a lot of confusion in Washington for those who don't deal with the relationship on a day-to-day basis, because notwithstanding everything that you just said, Mr. Ambassador, about the depth of the U.S.-Turkish relationship, the perception is that Turkey is moving away from the United States relationship and towards Russia, and this is despite the fact that they have been in a proxy war for a long time against Russia in Syria and now in Libya, and that there's been bloodshed between the two. Back in 2015, the shoot down of the Russian jet; in 2017, the bombing of a Turkish army position; and of course, just recently, 34 Turkish soldiers being killed. So are the perceptions in Washington wrong on this question, or can you help us understand why, despite all of this bloodshed, Turkey would be moving more towards Russia?
Will, I would refer that question to Ibrahim Kalin when he comes on.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Ambassador Jeffrey, I have, if I may, another question from another common friend, Soner Çağatay, here. Ambassador Jeffrey, do you believe that the conflict in Idlib will de-escalate in the short term, given Turkey's COVID-related contagion concerns, which have led Ankara to bring its military operations in northwest Syria down a notch, and the fact that Assad isn't yet ready to violate the ceasefire because Turkey has pummeled his army with a well-executed drone campaign?
I would agree with Soner's second observation. Pummel is the right verb. On the first one, absolutely not. What we have seen is a reinforcement of Turkish military elements in Idlib. As I said, we think this is a very good thing, both to keep terrorists under control and to ensure that, to discourage, I will say, or deter any new offensive by the Syrian regime. But I would point to other areas that are beyond my purview, where you are seeing continued fighting, including elements of the Turkish military, and would conclude from that COVID-19 isn't slowing these guys down. But again, that's a bigger question than I can answer, so over to David.
Thank you, sir. Will you have, but I also have another question here. Shall I continue?
Why don't you ask the next one, and I'll go after that.
Okay, wonderful. And Ambassador Jeffrey, another one again. So this is from International Organization for Migration in Gaziantep, Turkey. And what the question is, what other possibilities is the US exploring if Russia blocks the cross-border resolution in July, which allows for the crossing of humanitarian aid into northwest Syria?
First of all, I want to thank the IOM for its always courageous work, helping migrants, helping refugees, helping ease the terrible humanitarian situation involving Syria, and particularly the coverage of those right now who are doing this in Gaziantep and elsewhere in the face of COVID-19, far away from their homes. Our admiration is boundless. In terms of that question, we're very, very concerned about it. We, of course, are in consultation with the Russians on ways to extend that those two crossings when the resolution comes up in July. But also, the Secretary General, in his report that the 2504 resolution asked him to write on the situation, made crystal clear, as has Mr. Lowcock and other UN officials, that we also need a crossing into northeast Syria. The one that we had been using, the Russians refused to allow in the January negotiations. The Secretary General proposed Tal Abyad, which is in the Turkish Peace Spring area. We're willing to look into that. We supported it in December and January, but as I said, it didn't go very far with Russian opposition. But we think that one way or another, from one place or another, including taking another look at the Al Arabiya crossing that was shut down in January, we need to find a way forward. That said, we are absolutely determined. We're dealing with NGOs such as the IOM and many others, and with neighboring countries to figure out how to get humanitarian assistance into those who need it. If the Russians and the Chinese block a new Security Council resolution, as we've seen many of them in the past few years, authorizing that if it's blocked by them, and if the regime, as has been its want, refuses to allow humanitarian deliveries across lines, we will find ways to get help to the people who need it, one way or the other.
Great.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Will?
Yes, Mr. Ambassador, I'm going to combine two questions that I see from Jumana Kador and from Jared Zuba from Al Monitor. The United States has been trying to convince the Turks that they're thoroughly vetting the civil and military councils in SDF-led provinces. Can you tell us a little bit about what the state of that effort and if Turkey is satisfied with the results? And then just more generally, what do you see the future of SDS, PYD leaders and their parties and being part of a post-war political solution in Syria?
Okay. We have one principle involving all Syrian opposition groups, and our SDF partners and the local administration in the Northeast are part of that general opposition, but it also includes the Syrian people writ large, the people inside Assad's areas. Our only political agenda for them is to support the 2254 process that will allow a new constitution, because Syria definitely needs one that would not allow the kind of depredations that we've seen by the Assad regime, and free and fair elections managed by the UN. We have no political agenda with any group or with the Syrian people beyond that. We're not into regime change. We're into a change in regime policy, a very dramatic change in regime policy in all of the terrible areas, from chemical weapons to allowing terrorists to run amok, to allow millions of people to flee, to force millions to flee their homes that we associate with the Assad regime. So that's where we are. Our work with the SDF and other elements in the Northeast is focused on a platform to defeat ISIS. They're the enemy of the people of the Northeast. They're our enemy. They're the enemy of civilization. We're working closely with them. We keep the Turkish government and other governments informed of what we're doing. We have committed that anything that we're doing with these people will not threaten any of the neighbors, beginning with Turkey, and we will do everything we can to live up to those commitments.
Thank you, sir. I have another interesting question here from Ammar Kaf, Omran Center for Strategic Studies Syrian Center, which is based in Turkey. Why was Turkey not invited to be an integral part of the small group of Syria to coordinate politically better, while other less relevant countries are part of this group?
That's a good question. We would be happy to have closer relations between the small group and Turkey. Turkey, however, has become a member of the Astana group, and there would be problems of compatibility between the two groups, frankly.
Thank you, sir. Unfortunately, we are still on hold for Ambassador Kalin, and I would like to, just refer at his staff who are also on the line. Tuba Nur Hanım, backing up for Ambassador Kalin, and I'm receiving a message from her saying that he will be online in 2 to 3 minutes and apologizing for this unintended delay. And Will, you want to go with another question, either for Ambassador Jeffrey or Ambassador Satterfield? So this is a great opportunity that we found both of them in this platform. Just we shouldn't miss this.
That's right. We wouldn't be able to do this if not for everyone working virtually. It's really a benefit of this structure. I do have a question from Charles Lister at MEI, and he calls our attention to the fact that the Caesar Act is due to come fully into force in just a matter of weeks. What do you think the implications of that will be, and what do you think it might mean for some of our friends who are re-engaging with the Assad regime diplomatically and economically?
Will, thank you. As I mentioned at the top of the hour, maintaining sanctions and other economic pressure on the regime is an important part of our overall policy to get to a compromised political settlement. We see the Caesar Act that was passed absolutely overwhelmingly by the two houses of Congress as a very potent tool. It gives the administration authorities that we never had before to go after a broader band of criminals assisting the Assad state to oppress its own population. We intend on using that aggressively. After it was passed, there was a 6-month period where we had to take certain steps required in the law, and the law will be ready to roll out in June. And we intend on using it aggressively against the Syrian government and against those who are supporting it.
Fantastic.
Thank you, sir. Well, go ahead.
Sure. This may be a question more for Ambassador Satterfield, but I'm happy for Ambassador Jeffrey to answer as well. This is a question from Will Christou, who's a reporter from Syria Direct. And he notes that Erdogan said recently in December that he could close Incirlik if necessary. How does Washington view such statements like this?
The statement you referred to was made in the course of a quite long address. We operate with our Turkish partners. NATO operates with our Turkish partners out of Incirlik on a daily basis. There has been no change whatsoever in the operations of that facility, either from a bilateral US or from a NATO perspective. It is not an issue.
Thank you. And another question that we have from Tom Warwick of the Atlantic Council for Ambassador Jeffrey, probably. What's the status of the return to their home countries of the wives and children of Islamic State fighters that are in the Syrian refugee camps?
Okay. Right now, they're in special camps in the Northeast controlled by the SDF and local authorities. There's probably 70,000 of them. About roughly 50 to 60 plus thousand are Syrian and Iraqi. The Syrian ones are slowly being reintegrated into their communities. The Iraqi ones, this is a subject of discussions that we have with the Iraqi government. The Iraqi government has taken a number of steps to receive these people, and we think that that will be the solution to that. The remaining question is, let's say, 10,000 people from all over the world. That's tied up with the question of these countries taking back the foreign fighters, the terrorists themselves, because many of these people don't want to be separated from their spouses. We have had basically a full court press to push countries to take back refugees. We've had some success in North Africa, some success in Central Asia. We've had very little success, frankly, in Europe. One person was returned, one fighter was returned to Italy. We're continuing to press at every level. As you know, President Trump speaks about this himself from time to time. It's very much on our agenda. It is a major source of instability in the Northeast. We're very concerned about these people from a humanitarian standpoint, even on the margins from a security standpoint. And of course, we're very concerned about the fighters themselves from all of these points of view. So we're doing our very best. We've looked at other alternatives. There's some suggestions of, in terms of the fighters, having an international tribunal. We don't think those are good ideas. our policy is they all need to go, the family members, the fighters, back to the countries they came from. We have taken some 20 American fighters and others who have been in Northeast Syria back to the United States. We put some of them on trial. Others can do that as well.
Well, yeah, go ahead. I have a question, but go ahead, please.
Is Ambassador Kalin joined us?
Yes. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
We can. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir.
My profound apologies for the delay, but you know, these things, we are not the masters of our time. Ambassador Jeffrey will know this very well. So sorry about this delay.
Ambassador Kalin, welcome to our platform. It's
Thank
also
you.
an honor to have you. And we have been going through all these issues, you know, both Syria-related and US-Turkey related, both with Ambassador Jeffrey and Ambassador Satterfield, who also kindly joined today.
Oh, good.
Fred, would you like to give the floor to Ambassador Kalin?
Yeah, so Ambassador Kalin, it's so good to see you, and we all understand when there's a head of state or head of government calling on us, we respond. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to be very brief in my introduction of you. First of all, I want to say, Ambassador Kalin, Ambassador Jeffrey, Ambassador Satterfield, what a rich conversation this has been thus far. We've rarely had this many people come into a call with this many questions. Ambassador Kalin is the presidential spokesperson, as you know, chief advisor, deputy chairman of the Security and Foreign Policy Council for the Turkish presidency. He previously served as assistant undersecretary of state and senior advisor to the Prime Minister of Turkey. I'll be brief with the rest of it, but I know him as a person who's not only an important policy thinker, an advisor, but also an intellectual force. Once fellow of the Prince Alawid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown, PhD from George Washington University, and scholar of philosophy and Islamic studies, taught courses and published widely on Islamic philosophy, comparative philosophy, relations between the Islamic world and Western Turkish foreign policy. So he has the policy context, the context of real world issues he's wrestling with, but also the intellectual background. And it's up to you, Ambassador Kalin. You may want to make some sort of initial observations on the situation in Idlib, and then we'll bring you into the Q&A process.
Thank you very much, Fred, for this very kind introduction. Again, my apologies for the delay, and it's very good to see Jim, you there, and other colleagues, Daphne and others. And let me just very briefly underline a couple of points about the Syrian situation. The Syrian conflict is in its 9th or almost 10th year now, but of course now we have a conflict that has been compartmentalized, and that's one of the recurring themes or problems in the Syrian conflict. The issues have been disconnected from one another because different countries, different stakeholders seem to see this fragmentation serving their interests, and that's one major problem. The practical implication of this is that while you deal with one problem in the east of Syria, for example, you have a different kind of alliance system. And then you come to the west of the country, you have a different situation where your allies change the issues, change. You go to the south, or look at the situation issue by issue. For example, you look at the refugee issue, or you look at security issue. You look at the fight against terrorism, IDPs, or the political process. This has been a major problem with the Syrian conflict from the very beginning, because it has the tendency of producing this cyclical problems. You deal with one issue in one corner of the country, then something else pops up, and you have to deal with that without an integrated approach. It becomes a major issue. We have our own differences, for example, with the US policy to support PYD, YPG, but we agree on the situation in Idlib. But we did the deal, the ceasefire with the Russians, not with the Americans. We are doing humanitarian work with all kinds of different countries. So my point is that this the compartmentalized, the fragmented approach to the Syrian conflict has been a problem, and it looks like it will be a problem in the near future. Let me come to the Idlib situation. The ceasefire that we reached with Russia on March 5th is holding. Turkish and military and Russian militaries have been having their regular patrols there. They had, I think, the sixth one last week, and it seems to be holding. And we're glad that we had the ceasefire before the coronavirus pandemic. Can you imagine the mayhem, the chaos, and the panic, together with the situation in Idlib on top of the pandemic, etc. So we are happy that we had this ceasefire agreement. It's holding, but obviously it's a temporary measurement. It's not going to solve all the problems in Syria. The situation or the solution lies in the political process. And let me turn to this very briefly. There, we are facing difficulties with the Syrian regime because the regime is not interested in advancing the work of the Constitutional Committee, because they know they're afraid of a revised or a new constitution that will be binding. And that will lead, obviously, to either a transitional or interim government and eventually elections, free and fair elections in Syria. And the regime is not interested in any of this. That's why I've been raising this issue of the political process, the Constitutional Committee, transitional government, as well as the elections, free and fair elections in Syria. I know you may say, well, how realistic it is now to even talk about elections in Syria, free and fair elections. But I think we have to keep this on our agenda all the time. We can have free and fair elections in Syria if the Constitutional Committee is allowed to do its work, if there is a representative government there to include and represent all Syrians. And we can refer to UN Resolution 2254, which includes all these basic principles there also. So the political process needs to advance. But unfortunately, sometimes the attention of the international community is too much distracted. It's somewhere else. It's absent, not focused enough on the significance of this political work. In regards to the COVID-19 situation in Syria, I know that was in the questions, and people have been asking about this, and we're following this situation very closely in the areas under our control as well as in other parts of Syria. The numbers coming from different parts of Syria are not 100% reliable. WHO rightly pointed out that discrepancies provided by the Syrian regime about the COVID-19 cases in Syria. So we don't know exactly what's happening in Damascus or in Deir ez-Zor or other places. In the areas under our control, that is in Idlib, Ras Al Ain, and Afrin, and other places, we are providing medical aid. We are helping local medical staffers. We have not detected any significant number of cases so far, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't pose a threat. We are following this very closely, and we are calling for the international community, the UN, EU, WHO, and other institutions to pay more attention to the situation there. Lastly, the fight against terrorism in the Syrian territories continues. We had this terrible car bomb attack by PKK affiliated YPG in Afrin 2 days ago, where 40 people, including 11 children, were killed. And that's really, really terrible. I mean, they have no sense of sacrality. Even in the holy month of Ramadan, they killed people in this brutal attack, and that shows the significance of fighting against all terrorist threats in Syria, not just Daesh, but also PKK and other terrorist networks, Al Qaeda and others. We are determined to fight against the terrorist networks while continuing and strengthening our cooperation with our allies, United States, other countries involved in the conflict. But also, we will certainly continue the work that we've been doing with the Astana process and bring, hopefully, the Astana process under the UN process, so that the Geneva and Astana processes complement and support rather than contradict each other. this requires work on the ground. But as much as the world is distracted now by the coronavirus, the Syrian conflict remains as deep and as troubling as it was before this pandemic began.
Thank you very
So
much.
let me just stop here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
I continue with some questions. Yeah.
I have three very quick questions. First, and most importantly, what kind of time do you have for us today? Are you able to stay with us for another 15
Yeah,
minutes?
I'm available.
Okay. So we're gonna,
I owe you 45 minutes, so I'm
excellent. So we're going to keep for our audience. We're going to keep this open until 11:30. So we're going to go over by 30 minutes. I understand, Ambassador Jeffrey and Ambassador Satterfield, if you have other obligations, please let us know. But while you're here, please also join. We want to have a conversation amongst all of you, if possible.
Happy to stay on as long as Ibrahim's there.
Excellent. The second.
So that's a good friend.
The second question, Ambassador Kalin, is can you tell us anything about the conversation that you just had with President Erdogan?
I think.
Are we frozen?
Yes, Ambassador Kalin frozen.
Yes. Oh,
Okay.
There you are.
Okay.
Yes. Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Sure. Can you tell us anything about your meeting that you just had with President Erdogan? Looks like
This is a freezing facility for unwanted questions. Probably. Yes.
Yeah. We were in a meeting about the corona-related work that we're doing.
Yep, you're breaking up, sir.
Here and also and alliance with some of our citizens around the country. This
I'm wondering if Ambassador Kalin's staff can help him maybe disconnect and reconnect to see if we can get a better connection.
All right. Can you hear me now? Or
Yes.
Is it okay now?
Yes. Now it's better now. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Did you hear what I said, or shall I repeat?
Please repeat. Yes, sir. Please repeat if you can.
Okay. I was in a meeting with the president. We are related to the coronavirus work that we're doing here. But we are happy that things are under control here. Our numbers are, much implementing good results on the ground. Still, or are we frozen again?
Perhaps it might be easier to get you in by phone because you seem to be breaking up quite a lot. I'm wondering if your staff can work with ours to get.
Shall I reconnect again? Leave and reconnect.
I would say just turn off your video and just go to audio only and see if that's better.
Okay. How do I connect it?
Just there's a stop video function on the bottom.
How do I connect by phone?
Okay, now try to talk and see if it's better.
Okay, so okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, this is better. Yes, sir. Okay,
so I was in a meeting with our president about the corona fight here. Our numbers are much better compared to some other countries. Thank God for that. So we were doing some work on that. We are also providing medical supplies to a number of countries. We sent, as you know, medical equipment, a number of countries, some NATO allies and others. And we just finished the work on sending some medical supplies to Palestine and Somalia today and tomorrow. So, and also our president had a video conference with some of our citizens who received state aid. So I was in the middle of this couple of things, so I couldn't leave. That's the reason why I was late. But everything is under control. No earth-shattering emergency. It was, I think things were under control.
Well, thank you very much, sir, and thank you for having patience with their technical issues. I'll ask just one final question before maybe turning it over to Defna, for we are getting many questions from the audience, but it's a question that came up previously in the conversation and was deferred to you, which is there's a perception in Washington, D.C. that notwithstanding the strong relationship between Turkey and the United States through NATO and going back decades, that more recently Turkey is favoring Russia in comparison to the United States. And this is notwithstanding the fact that you're fighting a proxy war against Turkey in Syria and now in Libya. And there's been direct bloodshed in 2015, 2017, and just 2 months ago, of course, with 34 Turkish soldiers killed in a precision airstrike, which at the very least was abetted by Russia. Can you help our audience understand why, notwithstanding all of this direct conflict, there are decisions like the S-400 which lead Americans in Washington to feel that Turkey is pivoting towards Russia?
As I said in my earlier remarks, the Syrian conflict is a fragmented one. It presents a number of challenges, one of which is this very issue of who you work with in which file of the Syrian conflict. We began the Astana process because until then, the Geneva process under the UN did not produce any tangible results. And we were forced to stop the fighting. And we went to the Russians and the Iranians without disregarding in any way the Geneva process, of which we've been a member and supportive from the very beginning. We began the Astana process, and actually it produced some results on the ground. When the Geneva process was declared by many as practically dead, the Astana process actually produced results on the ground. It led to a number of ceasefires and cut on fighting and gave the local people a breathing ground. Now, we never, as I said, separated ourselves from the UN processes either. Our president has been in touch with his counterparts in NATO allies and the international coalition, and now we are still working with both sides. That is with the Astana process as well as with the Geneva process. And as you know, about a year and a half ago, we had the 4-country summit here, together with Germany, France, Russia, and Turkey, working on Syria and Idlib particularly. The Americans were absent. Jim knows the whole story behind it, but they were fully, briefed, and they followed obviously those meetings closely, like everyone else. And we didn't hide anything. And all we wanted was to make sure that we reach a ceasefire in Syria. It looks like this multi-party engagement, at least for us, will continue in the near future as far as Syrian conflict is concerned. There are areas in which we work with the US and other international coalition partners, and there are areas and issues for which we work with the Russians and Iranians more closely. And that seems to be presented or even forced by the nature of the conflict in Syria.
Thank you very much, sir. Defna?
Okay, I'm muting myself. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I have a question, and then I will also have a question from the audience, which is actually related to what you have been just talking about. Ambassador Kalin, we are also reading reports about the clashes between regime forces and opposition groups after the ceasefire, and many observers believe that the ceasefire is likely to collapse. The Syrian regime's offensive backed by Russia and Iran is driving the conflict, but another negative element are the radical groups in Idlib. And Turkey took responsibility for eliminating those radical groups in the latest ceasefire. What is Turkey right now doing to resolve this long-standing problem?
Well, the regime is not interested in serious or sustainable long-term ceasefire. The March 5th ceasefire that we achieved with the Russians was not welcome actually initially by the Assad regime, and we know that they will do everything in their capacity to undermine it. We have seen reports in the media that even some Gulf countries were bribing the Assad regime to break the ceasefire because they thought it was a victory for Turkey. And our interest there is not to control any part of Syria. It is not to exert influence in Idlib or beyond the Idlib territories, but is really to stop this fighting. Now, that obviously is a difficult work. Anyone who is familiar with the terrain will admit that it's a very complicated situation. The Idlib problem did not come about overnight. It's been kind of building up for the last 2-3 years, and it was really the failure of the international community that led this almost 3 million people to be squeezed in the Idlib area, and all the other groups, the radical groups, the terrorist groups against which we're fighting, they took refuge in those places, especially after the horrible attacks in Aleppo, and people were forced from Aleppo and other places, Hama and Humus, to move to Idlib. So this is something that's been kind of building up for some time. The Idlib is not an issue of the last few months. The complications you see there have been building up for some time, and it will take some time to sort it out. We are committed to fighting these terrorist extremist groups there, to neutralize them, to eliminate them. But we want to do it without, first of all, harming any civilians, without, secondly, giving the regime or the Russians or the Iranians another excuse for another military incursion into Idlib, because another military conflict or fighting in the Idlib area will lead to a horrible humanitarian catastrophe. So we are doing our best, but we would like to see more help, more coordination, more support from the international community, from the US, from Europeans, from Arab countries, from the UN and others, because the work we are doing there, Idlib, is not.
We lost you, sir. Ambassador Kalin, we lost you.
I'm sorry, where did you lose me? The whole thing or part
No,
of it?
just last sentence, sir. Right? Well, can you confirm?
Yes,
So,
just the last sentence.
Thank you.
So can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, what I said at the very end was that we would like to see more cooperation and partnership with our international partners, the US, the European countries, as well as other countries, the UN, all of which I know care about the humanitarian situation. But to end the human suffering in Idlib or in any part of Syria, it requires serious political work. So we should not lose sight of this fact. Itself doesn't help the situation. Our German colleagues were gracious enough to provide some funding for shelter in Idlib. That is good, but it's not enough. It doesn't address the root cause of the problem, and that is the irresponsible actions of the Assad regime and the support provided to them by its backers. And we need more work, all of us.
Thank you, sir. Just so, Will, do you have, or I have an interesting question here if you don't have? So
I have a question, just very briefly, and it's taken from a number of questions that we've gotten from the audience. So I'm going to combine a number, but the basic question goes to what you were just saying about the potential for improvement in collaboration and cooperation. And what some observers have noticed is since the most recent crisis in Idlib, there seems to be improved relations between Turkey and the United States. And just a couple of weeks ago, U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Kay Bailey Hutchinson, said that the U.S. is ready to provide an assistance package to Turkey if Ankara rejects the S-400 missile system. A Turkish official anonymously was quoted as saying that there's no going back on the decision to activate the S-400, but then it was also reported that the plan for them to be ready, this month has been delayed. And then just earlier this week, President Erdogan was reported to have sent a letter to President Trump calling for stronger collaboration between the two NATO allies. Can the current situation open the door to improved U.S.-Turkish coordination, not just on Idlib, but more generally with some of the big issues that divide the countries?
Well, certainly there is always room for deeper cooperation and partnership between Turkey and the United States beyond Idlib or Syria. We have a number of issues that have been kind of building up for some time. The issue of the PK presence in Syria, the fight against its branches in Syria, and as well as the FETÖ terrorist network present in the U.S., against which, unfortunately, neither the Obama administration nor the Trump administration has taken serious. And then on top of this, we have the S-400 issue. But those who are familiar with the history of this problem will remember that Turkey very seriously sought to purchase the Patriot missile defense system and spent enormous amount of time. Our president spent a lot of time on this issue, but unfortunately we were denied the Patriots with the conditions that we asked for. And then when our president raised the issue of looking for an alternative and go for the Russian missile defense system, S-400, people thought that he was bluffing. No, he never bluffs. He didn't bluff, and he straightforwardly said what he said he was going to do. Now, and also as a technical issue, we signed the agreement for S-400 with the Russians before the CATSA legislation was passed at the U.S. Congress. U.S. has its own, obviously, domestic political dynamics, but we deal with the governments. And we made it clear to our partners and colleagues on the U.S. side that we are interested in purchasing the Patriots, but it should come with no preconditions. Because the S-400 deal has been, as we've said many times before, and there has been a delay because of the coronavirus, but it will move forward as it was planned. But our president told President Trump several times on their phone calls that he is also interested in purchasing the Patriot missile defense system, increase our defense industry cooperation. And these things can happen only if we really remove this hurdle in our bilateral relations and stop putting any preconditions for improving relations and moving them forward.
Daphne, you have your mute on.
Yes. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Ambassador Kalin. Since we are also, since we are short in time, Ambassador, one last question from me, coming actually from Matt Bryza, who is also non-resident senior fellow in Istanbul of the Atlantic Council. Matt is asking, actually this can go to both ambassadors and all ambassadors actually. Can you foresee opportunities for US and Turkish engineering and construction companies to work together on reconstruction reconstructing northern Syria, provided there is ever agreement on an international funding mechanism?
Well, my quick response will be certainly, in principle, we don't see any problem with working with our U.S. colleagues, Europeans, and others. The terms of such an agreement need to be worked out, obviously, but in principle, I think the post serious international cooperation, but we still uphold the principle that no reconstruction before political resolution. We don't want to give the Assad regime, billions of dollars in construction and then have them come and destroy those places again. We understand this principle, but in the meantime, the emergency situation calls for a greater cooperation on the ground for the refugees and IDPs, and we are open to any ideas, any suggestions from our partners and allies to work on this together.
Definitely, that's exactly the point I would make. We are open to anything in those areas where the regime does not control, including the Northeast and the Northwest, not just humanitarian, but also stabilization assistance. But we are absolutely opposed to us or anybody else providing stabilization and reconstruction assistance to this criminal regime until it adheres to 2254 and we get a political solution to this conflict.
Actually, Will, thank you, Ambassador. Will, do you have any other question to add, just to Ambassador Kalin, or any other question?
No, you can finish.
Ambassador Jeffrey, would you like to comment on anything or add anything that Ambassador Kalin just shared with us?
Simply to say that you can see that we coordinate very closely together, not only with David Satterfield and our embassy, obviously, but also with Ambassador Kalin and the Turkish government on a whole raft of issues related to Syria. We cannot accomplish anything without the support of Turkey, as well as many of our other partners and neighbors. They're all very important to this effort.
Thank you, sir. Ambassador Satterfield, would you like to come in and just share a few remarks about, on the future collaboration between Turkey and the United States?
First, I'd like to say it's good to see Ibrahim and to know he's well. Distance communication is one thing, but nothing is the same when you can't sit and talk directly with your interlocutors. My only closing comment on my side would be simply to note, as I said earlier, the U.S. relationship with Turkey is a complex one. It is a rich one. It is global in its scope. It encompasses regional events, extra-regional events and interests. We look forward to expanding that relationship as much as possible. There are issues. We confront those issues directly. We hope we can work our way through them.
Thank you, sir. And Ambassador Kalin, last remarks from you, both on bilateral relations, Syria cooperation, and IDPs.
Yes, certainly, and I'm back. And good. I cannot see David, but I just heard him. So I look forward to seeing him soon in Ankara or in Istanbul, in Turkey somewhere. In person, in real time, hopefully, once this thing is over. We have worked very closely with our allies in Syria on a number of issues, especially after we secured the areas in the Ra'sullah and Tel Abyad region, and we did a lot of good work there. I think there was a lot of political drama when we began our our military operation against the terrorist networks there, but it ended up, I think, with mutual success with Vice President and Secretary Pompeo and Robert O'Brien and Jim and David all coming and contributing to, I think, a major understanding. And as a result of that, we have a more secure area there. But unfortunately, the terrorist activities of PYD, YPG continue in some other parts of Syria, and we have to protect our people. We have to protect the civilian people there. On the refugees and IDPs and the political process, I think we see eye to eye on many of these issues. The criminal nature of the Assad regime and the pressure that needs to be put on that regime and its backers to move the political process. We all agree for the mid or long-term reconstruction work. As Jim also stated, we hold on to the same principle of no reconstruction, major reconstruction, before a political resolution. But as I said, in the meantime, we have to take some emergency measures to help the IDPs and the refugees in Syria, and that will require some more work and participation, from our international allies. The Syrian conflict has entered its almost 10th year now. I think the Syrian people have suffered more than any other nation in recent memory. We really have to put aside our petty differences and short-term interests and small geopolitical games and prioritize the Syrian people. I think it's time.
Thank you, Ambassador Kalin. Ambassador Jeffrey, thank you so much for this important discussion. And Ambassador Satterfield, thank you for this, for enriching the conversation with your contribution. It's an honor to host all of you. And I'd like to thank also Will for co-moderating this together with me. And of course, Fred Camp for joining us today and supporting this initiative. And I'd like to also thank the whole team for making this real. I'd like to thank the audience as well today for joining and contributing with valuable questions. And I would like to apologize if we couldn't address to all, but we have, I don't know how many questions we received. It's really hard to track, which shows that we did something important for all countries, for all sides. And until next time, thank you so much. Will, would you like to say a few words as well before we close up?
Thank you very much, Defna, for helping organize this. I found this to be a wonderfully enriching conversation.
Thank you. Fred?
The only thing I'll say, Ambassador Kalin, is I've told everybody on the team that my celebration of post-COVID is on the Bosporus in Istanbul, so I'll see you then.
Indeed. I look forward to it. Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.